The morning mist clung to the ancient towers of Valdoria Castle like a shroud of secrets, and Princess Catherine Elena Rosewood stood at her bedroom window, watching the world she had known for 28 years slowly fade into memory. Her fingers traced the cold glass as she observed the royal gardens below, where she and Prince Alexander had shared their first dance 7 years ago during the summer solstice celebration. The irony wasn't lost on her that today, on another summer solstice, everything would change forever. Catherine had always been different from other royals. Born as the second daughter to King Edward of Eldermere, she never expected to inherit the throne. She spent her childhood reading philosophy books instead of attending etiquette classes, much to her mother Queen Isabel's dismay. While her older sister Princess Victoria learned the art of diplomacy, Catherine preferred working with the kingdom's charity organizations, getting her hands dirty in the real world beyond palace walls. Her unconventional approach to royal life made her beloved by the common people, but it also made her dangerous to those who preferred the old ways. Alexander, Crown Prince of Valdoria, was everything a future king should be on paper. Tall, dignified, educated at the finest institutions, and trained from birth to lead a nation. But beneath his polished exterior lived a man who questioned everything about the rigid traditions that bound his life. When he first met Catherine at a diplomatic dinner 3 years after her debut, he saw in her eyes the same rebellious spirit that he kept carefully hidden. She spoke to him not about trade agreements or political alliances, but about the books she was reading and the people she had met in the villages. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly seen. Their courtship had been a delicate dance between genuine affection and political necessity. Both kingdoms needed this alliance. Eldermere's agricultural wealth would complement Valdoria's industrial strength, creating a partnership that could secure peace for generations. But what started as political calculation grew into something neither of them had expected. Catherine found herself drawn to Alexander's quiet intelligence and his genuine care for his people's welfare. Alexander discovered that Catherine's unconventional nature wasn't rebellion for its own sake, but a deep conviction that royalty should serve rather than simply rule. The engagement announcement 18 months ago had been met with celebration across both kingdoms. The people saw a fairy tale romance between two young royals who seemed to embody hope for a more progressive future. The wedding, planned for this very day, was supposed to be the social event of the decade. Guests from 27 nations had arrived. The cathedral had been decorated with 10,000 white roses. Catherine's wedding dress, crafted by the kingdom's most renowned seamstress, hung in her dressing room like a beautiful ghost. But 3 weeks ago, everything changed with the arrival of a single letter bearing the seal of the High Council of Valdoria. Alexander had brought it to Catherine personally, his usually steady hands trembling as he handed her the parchment. The council had discovered something that would shatter their carefully constructed future. An ancient law, buried in legal documents for over 2 centuries, stated that any marriage between Valdoria's heir and a foreign royal must be approved unanimously by the council. One member, Lord Maximilian Blackthorne, had invoked this law and refused his consent. Catherine read the letter twice before its implications fully sank in. Blackthorne wasn't just exercising an obscure legal right. He was the leader of a faction within Valdoria that opposed any alliance with Eldermere, viewing Catherine's progressive ideas as a threat to traditional values. He had been quietly building opposition to the marriage for months, and now he held the power to stop it entirely. The letter made it clear that any attempt to proceed without unanimous consent would result in Alexander's immediate disinheritance. "We could fight this," Alexander had said that night as they walked through the moonlit gardens. "My father has lawyers studying every possible option. There might be a way to challenge the law's validity or find a loophole." Catherine had taken his hand, feeling the calluses he'd developed from his secret hobby of woodworking, one of the few activities that connected him to his simpler life. "And what would that cost you? Your relationship with the council? Your people's trust? Your rightful throne? You're worth any cost," he had replied, and she knew he meant it. But Catherine also knew that Alexander's sense of duty to his kingdom ran deeper than his love for any individual, even her. It was one of the things she admired most about him, even as it broke her heart. The weeks that followed were a blur of desperate consultations with legal experts, private meetings with council members, and increasingly tense negotiations. King Richard of Valdoria exhausted every diplomatic channel, calling in favors accumulated over decades of rule. Catherine's father threatened economic sanctions, then offered increased trade benefits. Nothing moved Lord Blackthorne. who seemed to relish his newfound power over two kingdoms' destinies. As the wedding date approached, the pressure became unbearable. Newspaper headlines speculated wildly about delays and postponements. Wedding guests began arriving despite the uncertainty, creating a surreal atmosphere where celebration preparations continued alongside constitutional crisis management. Catherine found herself caught between hope and resignation, loving Alexander more deeply each day while knowing that their time together was drawing to a close. 3 days ago, Alexander made the decision that would define both their lives. He came to her chambers at dawn, still wearing the clothes from the previous night's emergency council meeting. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes held a clarity that told Catherine everything she needed to know before he spoke a word. "I've decided to renounce my claim to the throne," he said simply. "My younger brother Marcus can inherit instead. We'll be free to marry and live our own lives." Catherine felt her heart simultaneously soar and shatter. The sacrifice he was willing to make proved the depth of his love, but she also knew it would destroy him. Alexander was born to be king. His entire identity was wrapped up in service to Valdoria. Without the crown, he would be lost, and eventually, he would resent the choice that cost him everything he was meant to be. "I can't let you do that," she had whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Valdoria needs you. You've spent your entire life preparing to lead your people. I won't be responsible for taking that away from them, or from you." They spent the next 2 days in a strange, suspended reality, knowing their decision was made but unable to bring themselves to announce it. They walked through the gardens, sharing memories and trying to memorize each moment. They sat in the library where they'd had so many philosophical discussions, reading poetry to each other. They attended formal dinners and smiled for photographers, maintaining the illusion that everything was proceeding normally while privately saying goodbye to their shared future. Now, as Catherine watched the sun rise on what should have been her wedding day, she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. The decision was made. In a few hours, she would stand before the assembled guests and wedding party to announce that she was releasing Prince Alexander from their engagement. She would cite irreconcilable differences rather than expose the political machinations that had destroyed their plans, protecting both kingdoms from the scandal that would follow if the truth became known. Alexander would marry Lady Sophia Beaumont, a Valdorian noblewoman who had been quietly suggested as an alternative bride. Sophia was perfectly suitable, intelligent, well-educated, and completely acceptable to the council. Catherine had met her twice and found her genuinely likable, which somehow made everything worse. Alexander would be a dutiful husband, Sophia would be a gracious queen, and Valdoria would continue unchanged. Catherine herself would return to Eldermere and eventually marry someone appropriate to her station. Perhaps Duke William of Northbridge, who had been courting her unsuccessfully for years. She would fulfill her royal obligations, attend ribbon cuttings and charity galas, and slowly let her heart turn to stone. The alternative, watching Alexander sacrifice everything for her, was unthinkable. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Your Highness." It was Marie, her lady-in-waiting, who had been with her for 10 years and knew her better than anyone. "Prince Alexander is here to see you." Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. This would be the hardest conversation of her life, but it had to happen. In a few hours, they would have no more opportunities for private words. Everything from this moment forward would be public performance. "Send him in," she said, turning from the window to face the door. When Alexander entered, she saw that he was already dressed in his formal morning suit, the one he was supposed to wear to the wedding ceremony. His hair was perfectly arranged, his posture impeccable, every inch the prince he had been trained to be. But his eyes told a different story. They held the same mixture of love and devastation that she felt in her own heart. "Catherine," he said simply, and in that one word she heard everything they couldn't say aloud. The love that would never die, the future they would never share, the choice that was breaking both their hearts but saving their kingdoms. She went to him then, not caring about protocol or propriety. In a few hours, they would be strangers. For these last few minutes, they could still be Catherine and Alexander, two people who had found perfect love in an imperfect world. He held her close, and she felt his heart beating against hers, memorizing the rhythm that had become as familiar as her own. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded against his chest, not trusting her voice. They stood together in the morning light streaming through her window, holding each other for the last time, preparing to walk out and perform the most difficult roles of their lives. In a few hours, the world would witness what they would call an amicable parting. Only the two of them would know it as what it really was: the death of everything they had dreamed of building together. The cathedral bells began to chime 9 o'clock, the time when guests would start arriving for what everyone still believed would be a royal wedding. Instead, it would become the most heartbreaking announcement in recent royal history. Catherine and Alexander stood together, drawing strength from each other one last time, preparing to step into their separate futures with grace and dignity. Even as their hearts broke in perfect unison, the grand cathedral of St. Aurelius had never looked more magnificent or more tragic. Thousands of white roses cascaded from every column, their perfume mixing with the ancient smell of stone and candle wax. Sunlight streamed through the famous stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor where Catherine and Alexander were supposed to exchange vows in just 3 hours. Instead, the cathedral would witness something unprecedented in royal history. Catherine walked through the cathedral's side entrance, her heels echoing in the vast space that could hold 3,000 guests. She wore a simple blue dress instead of her wedding gown, a choice that would spark endless speculation in tomorrow's newspapers. Alexander was already waiting near the altar, conferring quietly with Archbishop Cornelius, who had been practicing the wedding ceremony for weeks, and now had to prepare for something entirely different. The guest list read like a who's who of European royalty and international dignitaries. 27 royal families had traveled to Valdoria for what was supposed to be the wedding of the century. President Martinez of the Continental Federation had arrived yesterday with a security detail of 30 agents. The Prime Minister of the British Isles had cleared her schedule for the entire week. Even the famously reclusive Emperor of the Eastern Kingdoms had made the journey, marking his first public appearance in 5 years. All of these people were currently in their hotel suites and guest quarters, preparing for a ceremony that would never happen. Their wedding gifts filled an entire wing of the palace: priceless artworks, historical artifacts, and jewelry collections worth more than most nations' annual budgets. By evening, those gifts would need to be quietly returned, each one a reminder of the future that was slipping away. Catherine found herself thinking about the children they would never have. She and Alexander had talked about names during quiet evenings in the palace gardens. They both loved classical literature, so they had discussed Helena for a daughter, after Helen of Troy, and Marcus for a son, after Marcus Aurelius. Alexander had joked that their children would probably be more interested in books than royal protocol, just like their parents. Now those hypothetical children would remain forever imaginary, existing only in the dreams of a future that was dying with each passing hour. The media circus outside the cathedral was reaching fever pitch. Television crews from 43 countries had set up broadcasting equipment in the designated press areas. Reporters who had been covering the romance since its beginning were preparing what they expected to be fairy tale wedding coverage. Social media was buzzing with excitement as royal fans around the world prepared to watch the ceremony online. None of them suspected that they were about to witness one of the most shocking announcements in modern royal history. Lord Maximilian Blackthorne was also in the cathedral, standing near the front row where the Valdorian nobility traditionally sat. He was a tall, severe man in his late 60s, with silver hair and cold gray eyes that seemed to take satisfaction in the chaos he had created. Catherine noticed him speaking quietly with several other council members, probably enjoying his moment of ultimate influence. He had successfully prevented a marriage between two kingdoms, maintained what he saw as Valdorian purity, and demonstrated his power over even the crown prince. For him, today was a complete victory. What Blackthorne didn't know was that his victory would come at a terrible cost. The investigation into the ancient law he had invoked was revealing uncomfortable truths about how it had been used in the past. Historical documents showed that it had been created specifically to prevent a marriage between Valdoria's heir and a princess from a neighboring kingdom that practiced a different religion. The law was rooted in religious prejudice and had never been officially repealed, making it technically valid but morally questionable. When the full story eventually came to light, Blackthorne's reputation would be permanently damaged. Alexander's younger brother Prince Marcus was also present, though he looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation. At 24, Marcus had spent his entire life assuming he would have a relatively normal existence as a spare heir. He was studying archaeology at university and had plans to lead expeditions to explore ancient ruins. The possibility that he might suddenly become crown prince had never seriously occurred to him until 3 days ago. Now he sat in the front row, pale and nervous, realizing that his brother's sacrifice might thrust him into a role he was completely unprepared for. Catherine's sister Princess Victoria had arrived from Eldermere that morning, despite Catherine's requests that she stay away. Victoria was everything a traditional princess should be: elegant, diplomatic, and utterly conventional. She had married Duke Frederick of Westmarch in a perfectly arranged political alliance, and seemed genuinely happy with her predictable life. Seeing Catherine throw away what Victoria considered the opportunity of a lifetime was clearly causing her physical pain. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Victoria had said during their brief private conversation in the cathedral's vestry. "Alexander loves you. You love him. Everything else can be worked out with time and patience." "Not everything," Catherine had replied sadly. "Some problems don't have solutions that let everyone win." The most heartbreaking presence in the cathedral was Queen Isabel of Eldermere, Catherine's mother. She had arrived with King Edward 2 days ago, hoping against hope that some last-minute miracle might save the wedding. Queen Isabel had been initially skeptical of Catherine's relationship with Alexander, worrying that her daughter's unconventional nature might cause diplomatic problems. But seeing them together had convinced her that their love was genuine and deep. Now she sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, mourning the daughter-in-law she would never have and the grandchildren she would never hold. King Richard of Valdoria looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 3 weeks. He had fought harder than anyone to find a solution, calling in every favor and exploring every legal option. As a younger man, he had been forced into an arranged marriage himself, and he had desperately wanted his son to have the chance at genuine love that he had never experienced. His own marriage to Queen Margaret had been cordial but cold, a partnership based on duty rather than affection. Watching Alexander and Catherine's happiness over the past year and a half had given him vicarious joy, and its destruction felt like a personal failure. The wedding dress hanging in Catherine's chambers told its own tragic story. It had taken 6 months to create, with silk imported from the Eastern Kingdoms and pearls hand-sewn by the finest craftswomen in Eldermere. The design was both classical and innovative, respecting tradition while incorporating Catherine's personal style. Thousands of hours of work had gone into creating what was meant to be the most beautiful wedding dress in recent royal history. Now it would be carefully preserved in tissue paper and stored away, a symbol of dreams that never came true. Archbishop Cornelius was perhaps the most conflicted person in the cathedral. He had performed wedding ceremonies for 3 generations of Valdorian royalty and had been looking forward to blessing the union of 2 young people who genuinely loved each other. Instead, he would have to help them formally end their engagement in front of thousands of witnesses. The religious leader in him understood the importance of duty and sacrifice, but the romantic in him was heartbroken at the waste of such obvious happiness. The cathedral's music director had prepared a program of classical pieces for the ceremony, including Catherine's favorite Bach cantata and Alexander's preferred Mozart symphony. The royal orchestra had been rehearsing for weeks, and their performance was expected to be one of the highlights of the ceremony. Instead, they would play somber pieces more appropriate for a funeral than a wedding, providing a soundtrack to the death of a royal romance. Security arrangements for the day reflected the complexity of the situation. With so many high-profile guests present, the cathedral was surrounded by layers of protection. Secret Service agents from multiple countries coordinated with local police to ensure everyone's safety. But they couldn't protect anyone from the emotional devastation that was about to unfold inside the sacred space. Catherine looked at her watch and realized that in exactly 2 hours, she and Alexander would stand where they were supposed to exchange wedding vows and instead announce the end of their engagement. The timing was carefully calculated, late enough for all guests to be present, early enough to avoid the afternoon television broadcast that would carry the news around the world. The announcement would be brief and dignified, followed by a longer written statement that their press secretaries had been crafting for days. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were about to demonstrate the very qualities that made them perfect for each other: their ability to put duty above personal happiness, their grace under impossible pressure, their willingness to sacrifice their own desires for the greater good. These were exactly the characteristics that would have made them exceptional monarchs together, and exactly the characteristics that were now forcing them apart. Alexander caught Catherine's eye across the cathedral and smiled sadly. In that smile, she saw everything they had shared and everything they were about to lose. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of courting Lady Sophia Beaumont, following protocols that would eventually lead to another wedding in this same cathedral. Catherine would return to Eldermere and resume her royal duties, eventually accepting a suitable marriage proposal from someone who would never understand her the way Alexander did. But today, for just a few more hours, they were still Catherine and Alexander, two people whose love story was about to become a cautionary tale about the price of duty in royal life. The cathedral around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when fairy tale romance would give way to political reality, when love would bow to law, when two hearts would break in perfect synchronization for the sake of two kingdoms' stability. The guests began arriving exactly on schedule, unaware that they were about to witness the most shocking royal announcement in living memory. At precisely 11:30 in the morning, the first guests began filing into the Grand Cathedral of St. Aurelius. They came expecting to witness a royal wedding that would be remembered for generations. Instead, they were about to become part of one of the most heartbreaking moments in modern royal history. Emperor Akira of the Eastern Kingdoms entered with his characteristic dignity, his ancient ceremonial robes rustling against the marble floor. He had broken a 5-year retreat from public life to attend this wedding, believing that the union of Catherine and Alexander represented hope for a new generation of enlightened leadership. His presence alone was considered a diplomatic triumph, and his journey to Valdoria had required months of careful planning. Now, as he took his place in the front section reserved for heads of state, he had no idea that he would soon witness the dissolution of everything he had come to celebrate. President Elena Martinez of the Continental Federation arrived with her husband and teenage daughter Sophia, who had been eagerly anticipating seeing a real royal wedding. Sophia had followed Catherine and Alexander's romance through social media and international magazines, viewing them as the perfect fairy tale couple. She wore a new dress bought specifically for the occasion and carried a small camera to capture memories of what she expected to be the most romantic day ever. In a few minutes, she would instead witness her first lesson in how real life rarely matches fairy tale expectations. The Prime Minister of the British Isles, Margaret Henley, entered the cathedral reviewing notes for the congratulatory speech she planned to give at the reception. She had known both Catherine and Alexander since they were children and had watched their relationship develop with genuine affection. The political alliance their marriage would create was important for regional stability, but Margaret had been more interested in their obvious happiness together. Her speech, praising their love and predicting a bright future for both kingdoms, would never be delivered. Crown Prince Eric of Denmark brought his wife Princess Astrid and their twin sons, 7-year-old princes who had been promised they could see a real royal wedding. The boys had been practicing their formal bows for weeks and wore miniature formal suits that matched their fathers. They fidgeted excitedly in their seats, whispering questions about when the bride would appear and whether there would really be a horse-drawn carriage. Their innocent anticipation made what was about to happen even more tragic. Duke and Duchess William and Elizabeth of Northbridge represented one of Eldermere's most powerful noble families. William had been quietly in love with Catherine for years, proposing marriage twice and being gently refused both times. Today he sat with mixed emotions, genuinely wanting Catherine to be happy while secretly hoping that something might prevent the wedding. He was about to get his wish in the cruelest possible way. The extended royal family of Valdoria filled several rows, including Alexander's elderly great-aunt Princess Theodora, who at 93 was the oldest member of the royal family. She had lived through 2 world wars, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and attended more royal weddings than anyone could count. Princess Theodora had pronounced Catherine perfect for Alexander from their first meeting and had spent the morning telling anyone who would listen that their wedding would be the most beautiful she had ever seen. Lord Maximilian Blackthorne entered the cathedral like a man attending his own coronation. He nodded graciously to other nobles, accepted congratulations on his recent appointment to head the Cultural Preservation Committee, and basked in the attention that his opposition to the marriage had brought him. Several younger council members who had initially supported him were beginning to have doubts, but Blackthorne remained convinced that he was saving Valdoria from a dangerous foreign influence. The media section buzzed with activity as reporters from around the world prepared for live broadcasts. Royal correspondent Sarah Mitchell from the International Broadcasting Network had covered Catherine and Alexander's relationship from the beginning and had prepared what she considered the most romantic royal wedding coverage of her 20-year career. Her opening segment, describing the fairy tale romance between 2 modern royals, was ready to air in 15 minutes. Wedding photographer Helena Rodriguez had positioned her equipment to capture what she expected would be iconic images of royal romance. She had photographed 12 royal weddings in her career, but none had excited her more than this one. The genuine love between Catherine and Alexander promised to create photographs that would be treasured for generations. Instead, her cameras would capture something unprecedented and heartbreaking. The guest list included writers, artists, and humanitarian workers that Catherine and Alexander had specifically requested. Unlike traditional royal weddings that focused primarily on political and diplomatic guests, they had insisted on including people who represented their shared values and interests. Dr. Maria Santos, who ran a medical clinic in Eldermere's poorest district, sat near Professor James Coleman, who had taught Alexander philosophy at university. These guests represented the future that Catherine and Alexander had planned to build together, a monarchy more connected to real people and real problems. Children from the Royal Academy Choir had been practicing for months to perform during the ceremony. 12 young voices, aged 8 to 16, were prepared to sing Catherine's favorite hymn during the vows. The youngest, 8-year-old Emma Thompson, had been chosen for a solo verse and had been practicing every day since the selection. Her parents sat in the audience, bursting with pride at their daughter's role in royal history. Emma would sing today, but not the joyful celebration she had prepared. The cathedral staff moved efficiently through final preparations, adjusting flower arrangements, and ensuring that every detail was perfect. They had worked around the clock for weeks to create the most beautiful wedding setting in the cathedral's 800-year history. Head florist Michael Chun had created cascading arrangements of white roses, Catherine's favorite flowers, that transformed the ancient space into something magical. His work would provide a heartbreakingly beautiful backdrop for a very different kind of ceremony. Queen Margaret of Valdoria sat in the front row, her face carefully composed despite her inner turmoil. She had grown genuinely fond of Catherine over the past year and a half, appreciating the young woman's intelligence and compassion. As someone who had experienced her own arranged marriage decades ago, Queen Margaret understood the weight of duty, but she also grieved for the love that was being sacrificed. Her own marriage had been politically successful but personally empty, and she had desperately wanted something better for her son. Alexander's personal secretary David Sterling sat in the section reserved for palace staff, holding the original guest list that now seemed like evidence of a different timeline. He had spent months coordinating with Catherine's staff to plan what they all believed would be the most romantic royal wedding in decades. The detailed schedules, menu plans, and protocol arrangements represented hundreds of hours of work that would now be filed away as historical curiosities. In the royal box, King Edward of Eldermere sat beside Queen Isabel, both parents struggling to maintain their composure. They had raised Catherine to put duty above personal desire, never imagining that those values would cost her such profound personal happiness. King Edward kept checking his pocket watch, knowing that in just a few minutes, he would watch his daughter's heart break in public while maintaining perfect royal dignity. The international press section included reporters who had covered royal romances for decades, but none had ever expected to witness something like this. Entertainment journalist Rebecca Walsh had written dozens of articles about Catherine and Alexander's perfect love story and had prepared glowing coverage of their wedding day. Her laptop contained articles with headlines like "A Modern Fairy Tale Comes True" that would never be published. Security personnel stationed throughout the cathedral maintained their professional alertness while privately struggling with the emotional weight of the situation. Captain Thomas Reed of the Royal Guard had protected Alexander since he was a child, and had never seen him as happy as he had been with Catherine. Standing at attention near the altar, Captain Reed would have a front-row view of his prince's heartbreak. The wedding cake, a 7-tier masterpiece created by the kingdom's finest pastry chef, waited in the reception hall adjacent to the cathedral. Each layer represented a different aspect of Catherine and Alexander's shared interests: literature, music, humanitarian work, and travel. The cake would be quietly dismantled after the announcement, its beauty preserved only in photographs that would serve as melancholy reminders of what might have been. As the cathedral filled to capacity, an unusual energy pervaded the space. While guests expected joy and celebration, many sensed something different about the day. Conversations were more subdued than usual, and even the most experienced royal watchers felt an undercurrent of tension they couldn't quite identify. Those closest to the couple had noticed subtle signs: the absence of certain traditional pre-wedding events, the unusual timing of the ceremony, the carefully neutral expressions of the royal families. Lady Sophia Beaumont sat in the section reserved for young Valdorian nobility, unaware that she was about to become central to the biggest royal story of the decade. She had accepted an invitation to the wedding with excitement, never imagining that she would soon be thrust into the role of Alexander's alternative bride. Her simple presence in the cathedral would later be analyzed by media outlets around the world as evidence of a pre-planned arrangement. The orchestra began playing gentle classical pieces as the final guests took their seats. Conductor Maria Volkov had chosen music that would create the perfect atmosphere for a romantic ceremony. The haunting beauty of the melodies filled the cathedral with anticipation, but also with an underlying melancholy that seemed to foreshadow the heartbreak to come. Archbishop Cornelius took his place at the altar, his ceremonial robes magnificent, but his expression troubled. In 40 years of religious service, he had never faced a situation like this. He carried two different sets of notes, one for the wedding ceremony that should have happened, another for the unprecedented announcement he was about to witness. His role would be to provide spiritual context for what many would see as a senseless tragedy. At exactly 12:15, 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, the cathedral doors closed for the final time. 3,000 guests sat in perfect silence, waiting for a royal wedding that would never happen. Instead, they were about to witness Catherine and Alexander's soft, silent goodbye, a moment of such profound dignity and heartbreak that it would be remembered long after traditional royal ceremonies were forgotten. At 12:28, 2 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Alexander entered the cathedral through the side entrance traditionally reserved for the groom. Instead of his wedding attire, he wore a formal mourning suit in deep navy blue, a choice that immediately signaled to astute observers that something was wrong. His best man, his closest friend Prince James of Northumbria, walked beside him with a confused expression, clearly uncertain about the change in plans. The murmur that rippled through the congregation was subtle but unmistakable. Royal protocol was precise about wedding ceremonies, and Alexander's attire, timing, and demeanor all suggested deviations from the expected script. Wedding photographer Helena Rodriguez lowered her camera slightly, her professional instincts telling her that the images she was about to capture would be very different from what she had anticipated. Archbishop Cornelius stepped forward to the center of the altar, his presence commanding immediate attention from the 3,000 assembled guests. His voice, trained to carry through the vast cathedral without amplification, rang out with solemn authority as he began the most difficult announcement of his religious career. Honored guests, royal families, and distinguished visitors, he began, his words creating a hush so complete that even the cathedral's ancient stones seemed to hold their breath. We are gathered here today to witness an act of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. The confusion in the cathedral was palpable. These were not the words anyone expected to hear at a royal wedding. In the media section, reporters began exchanging glances and reaching for their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in royal history. Catherine entered through the main cathedral doors, walking alone down the endless aisle that she was supposed to traverse as a bride in just a few minutes. She wore an elegant dress of deep sapphire blue, the color of Eldermere's royal house, rather than the traditional white of a bride. Her steps were measured and graceful, but those who knew her well could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the careful control she was exercising over her emotions. As she walked, the true magnitude of what was happening began to dawn on the assembled guests. This was not a wedding ceremony. The absence of bridal attendants, the formal rather than ceremonial dress, the somber music from the orchestra, all pointed to something entirely different from what everyone had expected. Queen Isabel of Eldermere closed her eyes briefly as her daughter passed, offering a silent prayer for strength that Catherine would need to complete what was perhaps the most difficult public moment of her life. King Edward's hands clenched slightly in his lap, his paternal instincts warring with his understanding of royal duty. Emperor Akira of the Eastern Kingdoms leaned forward slightly in his seat, his diplomatic experience telling him that he was about to witness something of profound historical significance. The elderly emperor had seen the rise and fall of dynasties, but he had never witnessed anything quite like the scene unfolding before him. Catherine reached the altar where Alexander waited, and, for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they simply looked at each other. In their eyes was the entire story of their love, the first meeting at a diplomatic dinner, the carefully chaperoned courtship that gradually gave way to genuine affection, the proposal in the rose garden where they had shared their first dance, all the dreams they had built together. Archbishop Cornelius continued his announcement, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. Princess Catherine Elena Rosewood of Eldermere and Crown Prince Alexander Marcus of Valdoria have requested this gathering to announce that they are mutually and amicably ending their engagement. The cathedral erupted in a sound unlike anything ever heard within its ancient walls, 3,000 people gasping in unison, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Several guests audibly sobbed, including young Princess Sofia Martinez, who had come expecting to see a fairy tale and instead witnessed its destruction. Catherine stepped forward, her voice clear and strong despite the emotional hurricane she was experiencing internally. She had practiced these words dozens of times in her private chambers, but speaking them aloud, in front of thousands of witnesses, required every ounce of strength she possessed. "Your Majesties, Your Highnesses, honored guests," she began, her voice carrying perfectly through the cathedral's acoustics. "Prince Alexander and I have come to understand that our different visions for the future make it impossible for us to proceed with our planned marriage." The careful wording had been crafted over days of consultation with legal experts and diplomatic advisors. It suggested personal incompatibility rather than revealing the political machinations that had actually destroyed their engagement. Both Catherine and Alexander were protecting their kingdoms even in this moment of personal devastation. Alexander then spoke, his voice steady but carrying undertones of profound sadness that those who knew him could clearly detect. "Princess Catherine and I have the deepest respect and affection for each other. Our decision to end our engagement comes from a desire to serve our respective kingdoms in the way that will best benefit our people." Lord Maximilian Blackthorne sat in the front section, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes showing a gleam of satisfaction. He had achieved his goal of preventing what he saw as a dangerous alliance, though the method of victory was more public and dramatic than he had anticipated. Several other council members sitting near him looked distinctly uncomfortable, beginning to realize the full implications of their opposition to the marriage. The international media section was in barely controlled chaos. Reporters frantically typed updates on their phones while camera operators adjusted their equipment to capture what was becoming the biggest royal story in decades. Sarah Mitchell from the International Broadcasting Network was speaking rapidly into her headset, completely rewriting her planned coverage while events unfolded before her. Crown Prince Eric of Denmark's twin sons looked confused and frightened by the adult emotions they were witnessing. They had come to see a celebration and instead found themselves surrounded by grief and shock. Princess Astrid quietly gathered them closer, trying to shield them from what was clearly a traumatic moment for everyone present. Catherine and Alexander moved to stand side by side facing the congregation, presenting a united front even in the act of separation. This positioning was deliberate, designed to show that their decision was mutual and respectful rather than the result of scandal or betrayal. "We ask for your understanding and respect for our privacy during this difficult time," Catherine continued, her voice remaining steady despite the tears that several observers could see threatening at the corners of her eyes. "We believe that this decision, though painful, serves the best interests of both our kingdoms and our people." The wedding gifts displayed in the adjacent wing would need to be returned, each one requiring careful diplomatic handling. The 7-tier wedding cake would be quietly dismantled. The thousands of white roses that had been Catherine's favorite flowers would wilt in the cathedral where they were supposed to celebrate the beginning of forever. Queen Margaret of Valdoria dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, mourning not just the loss of a daughter-in-law she had genuinely grown to love, but also the loss of what this marriage could have meant for the future of royal tradition. Catherine and Alexander together had represented a new kind of monarchy, one more connected to real people and contemporary values. The orchestra, following predetermined signals from the cathedral staff, began playing a somber piece by Bach that served as a soundtrack to the most dignified heartbreak in royal history. The music filled the enormous space with melancholy beauty, providing an emotional backdrop for what many witnesses would later describe as simultaneously the saddest and most noble moment they had ever witnessed. Prince Marcus of Valdoria, Alexander's younger brother, sat in shocked realization that his life had just changed forever. At 24, he was completely unprepared to be crowned prince, having spent years assuming he would live a relatively normal life as a spare heir. His archaeological studies and Dreams of exploring ancient civilizations would now have to be set aside for royal duties he had never seriously contemplated. Dr. Maria Santos, who ran the medical clinic in Eldermere's poorest district and had been invited as one of Catherine's personal guests, wept openly for the loss of what she had seen as hope for a more compassionate approach to royal leadership. Catherine had visited her clinic dozens of times, working alongside staff and patients, and Maria had believed that as queen, Catherine would revolutionize royal engagement with social issues. Alexander reached for Catherine's hand, a gesture that sent another wave of emotion through the cathedral. Their fingers intertwined for what everyone understood would be the last time. A public goodbye between two people whose love had been sacrificed for reasons that most of the audience didn't understand but could clearly see were destroying both participants. "We thank you for the love and support you have shown us throughout our relationship," Alexander said, his voice breaking slightly on the word relationship, a word that would now describe something in the past rather than a continuing present. "We ask that you remember us not with sadness, but with appreciation for what we were able to share." The cathedral had become a temple to lost love, filled with witnesses to a sacrifice that felt both noble and senseless. Tomorrow, newspapers around the world would struggle to find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed. Television broadcasts would replay the moment endlessly, but no recording would capture the full emotional weight of seeing two people destroy their own happiness for abstract concepts like duty and tradition. As Catherine and Alexander prepared to speak their final words as an engaged couple, the cathedral held its collective breath, understanding that they were witnessing the end of what many had believed was a perfect love story. The soft, silent goodbye that was unfolding would be remembered as one of the most heartbreaking moments in modern royal history, a reminder that even fairy tale romances sometimes have tragic endings. Catherine and Alexander stood hand in hand for the final time, facing 3,000 witnesses to their love and its ending. The cathedral seemed to hold its breath as they prepared for their last words as an engaged couple, knowing that everything they said from this moment forward would define how history remembered their sacrifice. "Before we part," Catherine said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even herself, "we want to thank everyone who believed in our love and supported our future together. Your faith in us made our time together more beautiful than we ever imagined possible." Alexander's grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly, a tiny gesture that spoke volumes to those watching closely. "We have learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. Today we demonstrate that lesson, not out of lack of love, but because of its abundance." The words were carefully chosen to maintain dignity while revealing the emotional truth of their situation. Neither wanted their sacrifice to seem cold or calculated, but they also couldn't expose the political machinations that had forced this moment. The balance between honesty and discretion required every ounce of their royal training. In the front row, Lord Maximilian Blackthorne watched his victory with complex emotions. He had achieved his goal of preventing what he saw as a dangerous foreign alliance, but the public nature of the couple's suffering was creating sympathy that might eventually work against him. Several younger council members were already whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the human cost of their political maneuvering. Emperor Akira of the Eastern Kingdoms leaned back in his seat, his ancient eyes reflecting deep sadness mixed with profound respect. In his 91 years, he had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, but he had rarely seen such dignity in defeat. The young couple before him was demonstrating a kind of leadership that transcended political calculation. They were showing their people how to bear impossible burdens with grace. The media section was struggling to process what they were witnessing. Royal correspondent Sarah Mitchell had covered dozens of royal events, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her prepared coverage of a fairy tale wedding was useless. Instead, she was witnessing what might be the most emotionally devastating royal event in modern history. Her live commentary would later be praised for capturing the profound dignity of Catherine and Alexander's goodbye. Catherine turned slightly to face Alexander directly, and, for a moment, the 3,000 witnesses seemed to disappear. This was just Catherine and Alexander, two people who had found perfect love in an imperfect world, saying goodbye to everything they had dreamed of building together. "I want you to know," Catherine said softly, though her words carried through the cathedral's perfect acoustics, "that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Whatever the future holds, I will treasure every moment we shared." Alexander's composure finally began to crack, tears visible in his eyes as he replied, You made me believe that duty and love could coexist, that service to our people could be joyful rather than burdensome. I will carry that lesson with me always, even as I carry forward without you." The exchange was so intimate and heartbreaking that many guests felt they were intruding on a private moment. Yet the public nature of their goodbye was precisely what made it so powerful. They were sharing their most vulnerable moment with the world, refusing to hide their humanity behind royal protocol. Young Princess Sofia Martinez, who had come expecting to see a fairy tale, was sobbing openly in her mother's arms. At 16, this was her first real lesson in how adult life rarely matched childhood fantasies. Her parents tried to comfort her, but they were struggling with their own emotions as they witnessed the destruction of what had seemed like perfect love. Prince James of Northumbria, Alexander's best man, stood motionless as he watched his closest friend sacrifice his happiness for abstract concepts of duty and tradition. James had been prepared to hand over wedding rings that would bind Catherine and Alexander together forever. Instead, he was witnessing their final separation. The irony wasn't lost on him that his role in this moment was to support Alexander through the hardest decision of his life. The children's choir, who had been prepared to sing joyful hymns during the wedding ceremony, instead found themselves providing a soundtrack to heartbreak. Their young voices, trained to celebrate love and happiness, created haunting harmonies that seemed to mourn the death of possibility itself. 8-year-old Emma Thompson, who had practiced her solo verse for months, sang with tears streaming down her face, not understanding why all the adults around her seemed so sad. Archbishop Cornelius stepped forward to provide the religious context that such a moment demanded. "Love takes many forms," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in religious service. "Sometimes love means holding on with all our strength. Sometimes love means letting go with all our grace. Today we witness the latter, and we are all sanctified by observing such sacrifice." Catherine and Alexander slowly released each other's hands, a simple gesture that carried the weight of ending everything they had planned together. The symbolism was lost on no one. This was their final physical contact as an engaged couple, the last moment when they could touch each other with the promise of forever. "I release you from all promises between us," Catherine said formally, using the traditional words that legally ended their engagement according to both kingdoms' laws. "May you find happiness, and may your reign bring prosperity to your people." "I release you from all promises between us," Alexander replied, his voice steady despite the emotional storm he was experiencing. "May you find love again, and may your life be filled with the joy you deserve." The formal release was complete, but neither moved away from the other immediately. They stood in that sacred space between ending and beginning, holding on to their last moments together before stepping into separate futures that neither particularly wanted but both accepted as necessary. Queen Isabel of Eldermere found herself thinking about the grandchildren she would never have, the little princes and princesses who might have inherited Catherine's intelligence and Alexander's compassion, who might have grown up to lead both kingdoms into a more enlightened future. Those children would remain forever imaginary now, existing only in the dreams of what might have been. The international press was already crafting headlines that would define how the world remembered this moment. "Royal heartsbreak for kingdoms" would run in the International Herald. "Love sacrificed for law" would be the Times of London headline. The most dignified goodbye in royal history would appear in the Continental Daily. None of them would fully capture the emotional weight of what they had witnessed. As Catherine and Alexander prepared to leave the cathedral separately, she through the main door she had entered as an almost bride, he through the side entrance he had used as an almost groom. They exchanged one final look. In that look was everything they couldn't say aloud. Their enduring love, their mutual respect for the sacrifice each was making, their hope that history would understand their choice, and their shared grief for the future they would never build together. Catherine turned first, her sapphire dress rustling as she began the long walk down the cathedral aisle. Every step took her further from the man she loved, and closer to a life of duty without the joy she had briefly allowed herself to imagine. The 3,000 witnesses rose to their feet as she passed, a gesture of respect for her courage in the face of impossible circumstances. Alexander watched her go, memorizing the sight of her graceful exit from his life. When she reached the cathedral doors, she turned back once, briefly, and their eyes met across the vast space one final time. Then, she was gone, disappearing into the sunlight beyond the doors, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps and the memory of what perfect love looked like when it chose sacrifice over selfishness. The cathedral remained in complete silence for several minutes after Catherine's departure. No one seemed to know what to do next. This was uncharted territory in royal protocol. Finally, Archbishop Cornelius began a prayer for the brokenhearted, asking for divine comfort for all who had witnessed love's ultimate sacrifice. As guests slowly began to file out of the cathedral, many were already planning how they would tell this story to future generations. They had witnessed something that would be remembered and discussed for decades to come, not just the end of a royal engagement, but a demonstration of how true love sometimes means letting go, how duty can coexist with heartbreak, and how dignity can transform even the most devastating moment into something beautiful and sacred. The soft, silent goodbye between Catherine and Alexander was complete, but its impact would resonate far beyond the cathedral walls. They had shown the world that sometimes the most profound act of love is knowing when to sacrifice personal happiness for a greater good, even when that sacrifice breaks your heart in front of millions of witnesses. Their love story had ended, but their lesson in grace under pressure had just begun to influence how people thought about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of love.